Well, hello there, and welcome to the 164th edition of DF Direct Weekly, which is, and always shall be, even in the wake of the IGN acquisition, our weekly show discussing the latest gaming and technology news. Big amount of stuff to get through this week, so let's get straight to introducing the panel. Hello, Tom Morgan, he's back.
Hello again. Yes, it's me in the flesh. Always glad to be on. Lots to talk about today as well, so yeah.
You've certainly added to the roster of discussion topics, so yeah, good stuff there. And of course, John Linneman.
I'm so happy to be here and finally have in the flesh Tom Morgan back on the show. Always enjoyable to share the stage with Tom's flesh. So
yeah, Alex is just busy this week, if you're wondering why he's not here. So I guess, well, first of all, a quick shout out to the store, the Digital Foundry store, store.digitalfoundry.net. Visit it to help support our project and gain access to amazing merchandise such as this DF-approved Seal of Quality t-shirt. But with that out of the way, let's move on to our first news topic. Okay, first news story of the week. And to begin with, I've got to stress that this is actually filmed 24 hours after the initial direct filming, because this basically happened after we filmed. Tom's not available. John is. We've both discussed it. So I guess let's crack on. The story in question is this. Now, for months now, Ascendant Studios has been teasing that FSR3 frame generation is going to be added to the console versions of Immortals of Aveum, which means that, well, this is the first console implementation of frame generation. And it did indeed drop. And John's here, and we've both sampled it. And, well, I guess, first of all, let's basically check that it actually works. So I've got some assets here, which is basically Xbox Series X, because that was the patch that dropped first. And this is FSR3 off, and then FSR3 on. And you can see that, obviously, that the promise has been delivered. There is significant uplift in frame rates there. Based on my statistics here, I'm seeing a 72% increase in frame rate here. So on this intro scene to Chapter 3, which is a really good stress point, you can kind of see base frame rate at its worst, and then what happens when FSR3 is enabled. But in general play, what you'll generally find is that a game that kind of like operated in a 40 to 60 FPS area is basically now well into high refresh rate territory. I've got to stress that it only works if you've got 120 Hz mode available. It supports VSync on, VSync off. There's an option in the menu there, along with an FSR3 frame gen toggle. But crucially, it supports VRR, variable refresh rate, which is likely the best scenario for actually using this. So, John, that's actually a scenario you tested. So why don't you share some thoughts with us there?
yeah, I was largely impressed. I mean, I think we were both very skeptical about FSR3 on consoles when AMD first revealed it, because you have to hit sort of a minimum frame rate generally to produce a playable experience. But even in this game, which can be quite variable with its native frame rate, the first thing I noticed was that it actually manages to feel responsive. It feels basically like a 60 FPS, maybe higher kind of game. It's not doing anything exceptional on this, but it still feels good, right? So it is not impeded by any sort of input delay, which is critical point number one. Then secondly, it comes down to whether it can convincingly produce an image that looks like a 120 FPS game or near 120 FPS, right? HFR territory. And it does. It genuinely does. Like I was shocked seeing this work. It looks like a 120 FPS game, which immediately I was like, okay, this is extremely promising, because we're looking at, regardless of its visual faults, this is an Unreal Engine 5 game that's taking advantage of the UE5 feature set, right? So it's a big, heavy thing. And now we have a scenario where we're basically getting 120 frames per second out of it, effectively. Yeah. That's what it looks like, and that's what it basically feels like. But there are some caveats, as you'd expect. First of all, it is still, I guess, using FSR upscaling, which, as we know now, can actually be split out from FSR3. So technically, you could have a UE5 game, I think, use like TSR, but then also use frame generation, which would be probably a superior option because the FSR implementation in this game was never good, I would say. Like the image quality is largely bad. It's very
there are certain scenarios where, I mean, particularly like the view weapon, it just breaks apart pretty badly. Transparencies, hair, particles. These are all the things that FSR 2 isn't particularly great at, and it's almost like a showcase for that in this game.
This game and Jedi Survivor, for whatever reason, are among the worst we've ever seen. Where it's just pixel noise, all this nastiness, and it really doesn't look great. But that's not necessarily the fault of frame gen. That's just FSR. But the frame gen does introduce its own artifacts, which are, I would say, I can tolerate them, and I think they're not a huge deal. When you get this
definitely
uplift,
not unnoticeable,
but they're not unnoticeable. So first of all, it does not apply to HUD elements, right? So this game, especially at certain points, they love to put this like sort of floating dot HUD element to sort of show you, oh yeah, follow this person, right? Which means because it's a HUD element, a 2D element, it doesn't update it doesn't receive frame generation. So that basically runs at the base frame rate of whatever the game is at. So you have this sort of dot moving around the screen that looks like it's much choppier than the 3D, which can be distracting. Then there's the stuff with like, they have these like sort of boxes that pop up with sort of a transparent ghosty kind of look to them, where it's like a hard edge in the one corner and then it kind of fades out along the edge, right? But anything contained within that box, and it's used for objectives, tutorials, etc. Anything in that box area essentially looks like half rate. So during the intro, when it's like passing the camera over a large scene and you get this big tutorial box in the middle, everything in the center looks like half rate. It's kind of ghosty and slower looking. And they do like to keep that objective box on screen. So when you look up into the upper left corner, you kind of see that often. And what this got me thinking about, though, is that if you're going to design a game that uses frame generation from the beginning and you're anticipating this, I would say the HUD design should probably be built to take this into account, right? Like they could easily have made another decision about the HUD if they were intending to do this from the beginning. Obviously, they're not going to have the budget, or we know what happened with them, unfortunately, to change all of that stuff now. It's too late, but they could have changed that at the beginning if they knew they were going to have this technology available and created a HUD setup that doesn't introduce these artifacts, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's also some artifacts within frame generation itself beyond the HUD elements, really fast moving action, particularly objects really close to the camera that are panning by in a kind of lateral sense. You'll kind of see ringing artifacts, but the point is that the frame, and it's exactly the same sort of critique we had when DLSS 3 came out, which is to say that you've got these imperfect frames that are sandwiched between perfect frames, and because the persistence of each frame is actually rather small because you're in high refresh rate territory, it gets away with it for the most part. So you are getting a convincing high frame rate experience here, but obviously it's not perfect. But there are mitigating factors where, in the general sort of run of play, it's kind of acceptable. It looks pretty good, and I don't think people are going to have too many complaints about it. And going back to the initial sort of when we very first saw the imperfect FSR3, I don't think there are too many complaints about the actual quality of the generated frames. Rather, there are sort of surrounding issues with FSR3 that needed to be addressed. And there are still some surrounding issues that need to be addressed because, gameplay in Immortals of Aveum actually sort of turned out to run pretty well with FSR3, testing it on Xbox Series X. But here's a weird thing that I found. If we look at the frame rate graph here, in cutscenes, and I think it might be related to scene cuts or other scenes where you have extremely different movement from one frame to the next, we got these massive pauses, like 0 frames per second, which basically means more than a 1000 millisecond pause. This happened with VSync enabled on Series X, which is the only version we've looked at this point. So I think there's still a bit of work to be done there, assuming there's still engineering effort that's going into Immortals of Aveum. But it didn't seem to affect gameplay. This is just like first impressions, right? So it's not it's not perfect, and I did actually test it in VRR as well, and it seemed to be better, but I did also see like occasional pauses in cutscenes. Obviously, when you're looking at a display, we're not rolling out our frame rate tools or anything, but yeah, you could see that. So yeah, maybe still some work to do on FSR3, but it did only seem to be the cutscenes. So by and large, I think it worked pretty well.
I would also say that I've had issues in the past with FSR3 and VRR on the PC, and it's better here. But I still felt like when just walking around, looking around, there were just moments when it had a little bit of that judder appearance. And it was really difficult to pinpoint. I could just my eyes just detected, oh, something looks weird. And you could see this happen sometimes where like certain camera motions that I might do didn't look as smooth as you would expect them to look.
Yeah.
But it wasn't nearly as bad as when I use like FSR3 and like Avatar or something like that. So, but it's definitely not flawless. But then switching frame gen off, it was immediately clear, like, oh, it's much preferable to what it was doing otherwise.
Well, that's the key thing, right? Because this was a game that didn't particularly have a stable frame rate. Running at 60 frames per second, but that's the sort of crucial taste test, if you like, which is to say that turn it on and then turn it off again. Which do you prefer? And I think we both would prefer FSR3 frame generation on in this case.
Exactly, and it's I guess the other option in there that I thought was kind of the VSync off option. I'm very curious why that's there. I mean, I guess maybe for input response, but it just looks so atrociously ugly when you turn it off.
I think actually, when you're at 120 hertz and you have screen tearing, obviously the persistence of the tear will be like, half that at 60 hertz. So, it might actually pass muster for people that don't want VSync sort of hitching. And I've got to say, if you look at the VSync, if you look at the frame rate analysis we did, there can be bits where, VSync seems to have like long persistent frames, which can be a bit off-putting. So you do at least have the option of VSync on or VSync off. So yeah, I mean, it's not to our taste, but it is there for people who want it. But ultimately, I think we've both agreed that if you're dealing with an unstable frame rate, and it is unstable, but you're in the high frame rate window, and you've got VRR, it broadly becomes less of an issue to basically no issue, and it actually runs really quite well.
Yeah, I would say that beyond the implementation in this game itself, and it's pretty good, not perfect, but pretty good, this really bodes well for the future. And I hope we see other developers attempt this, because that boost to 100 to 120 FPS territory is sort of a game changer in terms of just visual presentation. You can get a lot more or a lot more fluidity for your buck, so to speak.
Yeah.
And this suddenly makes other, these more advanced games a little bit more viable at this high frame rate. I'll also be curious to see what this means for something like the PS5 Professional, right? Which will have a little bit more grunt to throw around. And that's a case where we know the CPU is not a significant upgrade over the base PS5, but the GPU seems to be significantly more so. And I'm wondering if you can leverage that to do some serious high quality frame generation stuff.
Yeah, I think the other thing, of course, is that AMD itself describes the base frame rate that you need as 60 frames per second, but this one is kind of all over the place,
not that.
Really.
Yeah,
and,
I was surprised.
It still holds up, right?
Yeah, it still feels good.
So I'm kind of curious if the games that have 40 FPS mode could, use FSR3 to basically unlock that frame rate and then take you into high frame rate territory with frame generation. It's an interesting new tool. I've just been sort of mousing through 120 frames per second captures as we've been discussing this, and you can see that, when you have those big pyrotechnic effects, you do definitely see the quote unquote real frames and then the fake ones that are interpolated between, and they are very definitely imperfect, but it's happening in a really high action, fast movement scene. So I guess, it kind of presents more as a sort of weird strobe. But, even so, I think another thing which is quite cool about this is that Immortals of Aveum was a free monthly game with PlayStation Plus. and it's on Game Pass right now. So, there's lots of opportunities to actually test this without actually having bought the game. It's now moved into a new phase of its life cycle. So very, very definitely worth checking out, I'd say. And I'm going to be looking at this to see whether, I'm kind of curious if there's a Series S implementation. That would be great.
Oh, you're
Just
right.
to see that. Because based on Oliver's tests, the Series S version actually had a far higher frame rate than
Right.
Series X. That's kind of curious. Another thing which I noticed, just a final point, is that with FSR frame generation off, but running at 120 hertz with the system set to 120 hertz, the non-frame gen version actually can run faster than 60 frames per second, but in very, very limited scenarios, obviously when there's not much going on. But yeah, that was an interesting PS to add to the coverage. So I think we're going to be doing a bit more on this, but first impressions are certainly very, very positive. And as I said, there's plenty of mechanisms to sample this without having to outlay any money. So, check it out, I'd say.
I would also say, though, you say the first impressions of FSR3 are good, but the first impressions of this game are not. If you're going to play this game, I do recommend giving it a bit of a shot. Like, you got to put a little time in. I feel like going through it again, I think the introduction sequence, it's terrible. It's ugly. It's unappealing.
It's a bit weird, isn't it? It's just kind of like a big traversal section that lasts for way too long.
Yeah, and it's drab, and like you don't know what's going on, don't care about the characters, like nothing matters. I genuinely don't like it. And then eventually after that, you have to go through this horribly long tutorial thing, and it's just like the opening like 40 minutes are just, I don't know what they were thinking. It's just not good. It's just not that interesting. The game actually does pick up a lot, but man, absolutely. That intro sucks.
It's also kind of weird how you get all of your powers just given to you straight off the bat in an extended tutorial section where it could have possibly been better paced and unlocked.
I feel like they could have done a full level at least where you're like fighting through and slowly gaining those abilities, something like that, just something different. And also like the intro area, like conceptually it's cool, but when you have some of the powers of UE5 with like Lumen and everything, like the way they chose to light this scene, it's really ugly. Like it genuinely, like there's times where I'm looking at this and it's like, this is like a large scale PS triple game, just in terms of the way it's lit. It's very, very just not.
I get what you're saying. But I think we're both agreed it does get better. I think sort of chapter 3 onwards.
Significantly better. It's actually quite a fun little game. And there's some neat stuff in here. And it does look beautiful too. Once you get through that. So that's just my point. If you're going to sample this on like Game Pass or something, you might be inclined to shut it off right away, but don't. Stick with it.
Okay, well, that's everything we've got to say about FSR3 frame generation on Immortals of Aveum right now. So I guess at this point, John and I from the future are going to sign off, and we're going to sort of time warp back 24 hours to check out the rest of the Direct. So yeah, let's do it. Okay, so this one's quite interesting because, last week we posted our big DF Tech review for Hellblade 2. And it's safe to say that, put it this way, every time we put out a call to questions to our supporters, we list the topics we're going to be talking about. And I was astounded to see so many different questions and points being raised about Hellblade 2. Certainly a very controversial game. And I'm going to go to you first of all, John, because you did our main tech review for it. Fantastic stuff. And how are you judging the reaction to Hellblade 2 so far?
Oh, I'm not at all surprised by it. It makes perfect sense when you consider what type of game this is. More than many, I feel like this is something where it's just not going to work for everyone. But the people it does work for will really resonate with, right? Because it is effectively, it's a story-driven game. And by that, I mean, it's more focused on telling a story than it is core gameplay. I might even go back and say that something like Another World fits into this kind of area. You know what I mean? Because Another World has platforming like controls and such, but it's not really a platformer. You're more like reacting to things, and it's very cinematic. And that was revolutionary at the time. And this feels like a sort of a modern take on that. We've seen this kind of stuff in the indie space a lot, but we haven't seen that many like big AAA class games that do it. And this is one of those. And then you combine that with essentially, I would say, the best use of Unreal Engine 5 in a console game we've seen to date. It's explaining all the features. So virtual shadow maps, lumen, nanite, all that stuff's there. But of course, just having those features alone isn't magic, right? There's obviously a lot of artistry that needs to go into it. And that's kind of where it really, really works. And this is... I think it's because of this insane visual quality. It has more people than usual looking at this type of game, and the people that are just looking for straight action style gameplay are going to be like, what is this? But then the people that really get into the experience will appreciate and enjoy it. And I admit, even like the introduction, I was like, I mean, I knew it was going to be this type of game, but the introduction was very slow.
It's tough going for sure.
You wash up on the beach and it's like she's injured and walking. It's like the slowest slow walk sequence you could imagine. Right? And it's just like...
It is, yeah. Uh-huh.
And technically there is a lot of walking in this game. That's pretty much what you do a lot of the time. But somehow it's just the scenery, the storytelling, like the story actually gets really interesting and good, I think. I enjoyed it a lot. And there's just some cool scenarios and sequences and things in here that you don't usually see in games. And I would say it's one of those first games where at times it looks so good that you could swear it's a pre-rendered movie. And that's not even like in a hyperbolic sense. Like there's certain things about the way the lens effects works, the complete lack of pop in when they do those perfect like flyovers. There's zero hiccup skips. And of course, all those filmic effects layered on the high detail. It does genuinely look more like a rendered movie at times in a way that I'm not used to seeing. And that is just, that's pretty special. You can tell they put a lot of time and effort into getting it to look just right. And so it's eye-catching. People see that and they're like, holy moly. Maybe they don't say holy moly. I was going to say something else, but then I censored myself there a little bit. But they, there's excitement.
Gee golly.
Gee whiz. This sure is an impressive looking game. So all of that stuff together, I think it's no surprise to me that it's getting a lot of attention, but also slightly controversial. And I kind of hinted at this in the video, by the way, but maybe you guys agree. I feel like this is the Xbox equivalent to the Order 1886, which is to say,
I think so.
Right? Like the gameplay, like that's shooting instead of sword swinging, but it's fundamentally a very narrow scope game that's all about taking you on a journey. Well,
arguably, it's an hour scope. One might say,
right?
Because there's, if you're talking about the sort of proportion of shooting and walking in the Order to the proportion of combat and walking in Hellblade 2, there's a lot more walking.
I guess that's true. Yes, Hellblade 2 does have more
I understand
walking,
your point,
but
yes. Yeah, it's just interesting that obviously when you see a game like this, the immediate association is that you're looking at like a AAA gaming juggernaut, but it's not a AAA experience in terms of what you would come to expect from sitting down to play a AAA game. It's just not like that, but it does have those incredible visuals, which, basically right at the top of the pile in terms of anything that's been generated this generation is quite remarkable. But there is, I think, going in a level of expectation from people that's not going to be met by the game, which, it takes a while to actually adjust to what Ninja Theory is offering up here. But, generally speaking, there's a lot of, I'd say, understandable criticism going on because, it's not, I'd say it's probably even less interactive than the first Hellblade.
It is, for sure.
By a long chalk, I'd argue. So it's a very, very interesting and strange experience. And you have to be completely dialed into what Ninja Theory is trying to achieve here. And I think a lot of people aren't going to get it. Tom, what do you think?
Well, I think it's an amazing showcase for Unreal Engine 5. As John pointed out in his really great tech breakdown, I watched it last night. It is almost forcing you with the pace that it's got to hone in on those details. I mean, I took in only about an hour's worth of gameplay myself. I was looking at things like wow, they've got with every strike you make against the first Northman on the beach, you're leaving a massive gash, a massive indentation exactly at the line of attack, and and I noticed things like as Senua was climbing the rock face, you don't have any clipping of physics space, like the physics hair. The hair going behind her and all the rest of it. It feels like they've really honed in on this idea that everything has to be sort of perfect. Even if it is, you're moving at a glacial pace, they really wanted you to feel like, this is indiscernible from a film. And they nailed it. They really did. And I think Another World is a great sort of analogy to use there, because it is just our generations. Here's what the next generation of games, I guess, certainly UE5 games, are going to look like.
Well, maybe. I think this
with optimization.
No. What I mean is, like, the other side of the coin is that generating this kind of quality at this level. I mean, this is a very constrained game. It still took many years to make. This is not easy work, and it starts to come down to time and manpower and money more than anything else, right? Yeah,
for sure. Yeah. I mean, the team isn't the biggest. I mean, I wouldn't have said, certainly looking back at Hellblade 1, it was a relatively small team, and I'm sure they've upscaled that team size since. But
apparently it's still an 80 staff member studio.
80 staff.
Yeah.
That's still pretty substantial.
That's kind of about the same size that Criterion Games had during the sort of Burnout 3 period. So it really is still a small studio. I mean, there's not the hundreds of people involved.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's not like 200 strong, which we'd expect of the major AAA releases sometimes.
Well, I'm sure they have outsourced companies doing a lot of asset generation and such, though. I would imagine anyway. That's pretty typical. I'd be curious. I'd need to see the full credits in detail to see what that. But I guess my point is, like, I hope people don't look at this and say, "Man, I can't wait to play a giant 100-hour open world game with this level of fidelity."
Yeah, no,
because I just don't. I mean, some aspects of it should be possible, but not at the whole game at that level. I just don't think it's feasible realistically from a manpower perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, the star of the show is, they're putting the facial animation stuff like front and center. And from what I understand of what you played, John, it's really pushing that with more characters and more of a story-driven dynamic than the first game, which is good.
Let's go to some supporter questions, because man, there's and supporter comments even, because there's a lot of them. This one, let's kick off with this one from Samson. Hey DF boys! ! There's a little Z or Z on there.
Of course there is.
Of course. Diving into Hellblade 2 on PC was definitely visually and narratively impressive on my 4090. It's the perfect game to make your rig break a sweat. By far the best showing of what can be done cinematically and graphics-wise in Unreal Engine 5. While I share the criticism that Ninja Theory missed the mark on building upon the previous game's primitive combat and puzzles, I do believe people have been very harsh towards it. Do you think it's due to where Xbox is with public opinion, or is the harshness justified? I think it's just basically an expectation level, based on, where gaming is, that, Ninja Theory just wasn't really interested in doing. And it's quite interesting, in my part of John's video, we were talking about a perspective, could a Series X do a 60 FPS mode? But I don't think it's even on Ninja Theory's radar, even if they were sort of asked to do one. I just don't think it's relevant to the kind of vision that they are attempting to bring to the player there. I just think it's something that's very different and very challenging compared to people's preconceptions from what they are expecting from the game. But ultimately, I think there was an expectation level set. And maybe some of the sort of marketing material for it, just didn't do a great job of communicating what they were trying to do. Because, I mean, it's kind of been a bit of a running joke on DF Direct Weekly about the marketing materials we have seen, in particular the going into a cave and coming out of a cave one. John, what do you make about this?
Yeah, I don't think people are necessarily... when you look at the overall Metacritic score, for instance, I think 81 is what it's at the moment. That's pretty darn good for a game like this, for this sort of more of an art game experience. I mentioned The Order earlier, and that's like 63. That was definitely hurt by expectations of people. Like they wanted a Naughty Dog style, or even, they wanted something bigger than it was, and it was not that. And I think people were generally taken by this. And I think considering the type of game this is, the split makes sense, but that it largely, most people and reviewers recognized it for what it is, and it still has done pretty darn well, I would say. So I don't really think there's that much to say about the negativity around it, because there's not that much. I think they've been pretty darn fair overall. I think the only real disappointment in terms of, like you said, Rich, in some ways, I don't think it's unfair to have expected a little bit, like to take some of the concepts from the original and actually expand them a little bit, right? And they kind of regressed actually in terms of what you can do. I mean, it didn't actually end up ruining I love the experience. I thought it was really neat in the end. But when you look at the combat, it really is just one opponent after another, with little scripted scenes between every opponent, right? Like there's zero agency there. It's just, it almost turns into like a simplified Punch Out at some point, where you're just like, you're just dealing with, you know what it reminds me of Infinity Blade, but like obviously much more cinematic. But it's that kind of, it's like the Infinity Blade battles where you're just kind of fighting battles, and then you go to the next one and you keep fighting. Like
I loved that game. I really did back in the day.
That was a cool mobile game. It was really impressive. Yeah. So I think that's just, when you look at it from that perspective and you think like it's a big first party thing, I actually think it would have been received probably about the same everywhere. Right. It actually, the only thing, maybe there's even a bump because I think people are worried about Ninja Theory's future as well. A subset of people with what's been happening lately, but I think they'll be fine based on what we know.
Yeah, there's been some reports, I think sourced from Jez Corden, that the next Ninja Theory game has already been greenlit, and I really hope so. And I think it's almost certainly likely to happen because, you look at the quality of this game, and ultimately they've executed exactly what they wanted to achieve. Yeah, and the quality there is undeniable. But obviously though, the question is now, what would happen if you scaled up a studio like Ninja Theory? Would you actually get the kind of game people were expecting, or do you think it's going to stay pretty much the same size? Still very creative focus.
The thing is, though, is you look at all their prior games, and they've all been kind of these linear focus, but they've had more complex combat scenarios and just more mechanically dense elements in them. I think they can do that again. It doesn't. They should not tackle something too far beyond their scope, but something like Enslaved, or even DMC, which it's it has its issues, but I still thought it was an enjoyable time. But Enslaved was one I especially loved. That was extremely memorable, and that's in a way that's similar to Hellblade, less so, but it's that simple sort of almost automatic climbing. There's some light puzzles in there. The combat's fun, but also pretty simple. I mean, there's just more of it in general, but I'd like to see them sort of continue in that direction. I think they can do it.
I got this comment here from Leo DeWeeb, who basically seems to sum up what we were talking about, really. Hello, DF fellas, ! I'm really saddened by the harsh reception Hellblade 2 has received. I actually think a lot of this is, if you look at the sort of critical consensus, that I don't think there has been a harsh reception.
I'm confused by where he's seeing this.
Well, there's a lot of discourse online. But online is proving to be an increasingly toxic environment to have any kind of discourse. But anyway, he's saying, while there are certainly constructive criticisms that can be offered about the game, I genuinely believe much of the negativity comes from a lack of open-mindedness about what games can be. Ninja Theory wanted to do something different with Hellblade, and many people seem unable to appreciate its unique approach, which at the end of the day may discourage developers from being daring and creative, and instead opt for games that feel more familiar and aligned with mainstream expectations.
I agree. I definitely agree with that. It's so much. It's a worry with because after what's happened with all these Xbox studios, you'd worry that Microsoft needed a big action game to kind of rally up a lot of interest from a wider audience, and instead they've let Ninja Theory do their own thing. So I absolutely agree with Leo Daweeb that letting them do their own thing is absolutely to Microsoft's credit and Ninja Theory's credit that they were stubborn enough to push for this type of game design. Something that goes against the grain in terms of what our expectations in with modern games, the pacing of modern games in an era of a Call of Duty style, quick run and gun. So it's great to see it, and more power to them. I would hope the next project, as John has mentioned, does go back to a more sort of interesting, a different format, let's say, closer to Enslaved, which I also really enjoyed, but it's, if they're picking a certain vision, and they had one based around this idea of mental health and, creating this insular world inside this person's mind, they hit the mark, I think. And, that's all power to them for that.
Got a couple of points here, which I think is a really interesting discussion point. Vinny Hardio says, "Hey, DF team, exclamation point. I'm curious to know your thoughts on what seems to be the cause behind the commentary that games such as Hellblade 2 are quote unquote only 7 hours long, and the experiences such as that are seemingly quote unquote not good enough for a AAA game. Seems like nowadays smaller experiences made by AAA studios are being criticized for their length instead of applauded for their focus. I personally enjoy smaller, more focused titles, as I don't have hundreds of hours to pour into games anymore, but it just seems like if your game isn't a 30-hour plus experience, it's immediately criticized nowadays, at least on the Xbox side of the fence. I just find it curious because it's not even a full-priced $70 game, and yet people complain anyway. And this one from DF Enjoyer. Hi everyone! Exclamation point. The controversy over Hellblade's length is really frustrating. When did length become more important than quality? One of my favourite underrated games is Spec Ops: The Line, which is only 5 to 6 hours long. There are also many games that push the envelope in terms of fidelity but get bashed until years later, like Rise, Son of Rome, and The Order 1866. Give it 10 years and people will be praising Hellblade for what it attempted to do. Yes, the gameplay is okay, but everything else is pushing the envelope. Also, shame on Xbox for the marketing." Right, okay. John, how do you want to unpeel this particular onion? Because this sort of concept of how long a game should last, it's only really sort of come to the fore, I think, probably since the sort of Xbox One, PS4 generation. If we go back, a lot of games, particularly, the older style console games, typically only had about 5 to 6 hours of what you might call raw content in. So and we do seem to have sort of, we're maybe missing the mark there.
I don't know. I actually do distinctly remember people already complaining about this back in like the early 2000s, because it was right around the time when RPGs started to become popular. Especially with mainstream, after the success of something like Final Fantasy VII, I do remember conversations starting to appear of people being like, "Oh, it's only X amount of hours long," and then you had bangers like Metal Gear Solid 3 and Resident Evil 4 coming out that were like 20 hours long, which was unheard of for that type of game. And I think expectations slowly started to shift into that direction. But yeah, like you said, though, it's probably around 2013 when it really became super common and super annoying. And it's in some of these read like, "Oh, this is only just happening," but it's really a constant thing that I see all the time with any game that's not super long. And it's just it's unfortunate, but that's tricky. So for some of us, I think this is a matter of you kind of gotta know, and you gotta pick for yourself based on what your needs are. Like, I think for us, shorter games are great, but then there's people that have infinite time, especially the younger crowd that, for them, this would not be worth the money if they were buying it outright. Right. There are people that are just going to spend insane amounts of time playing something, and that's all they need for a long time. And yeah, maybe this isn't for them. I don't think there's any like large consensus one way or the other. I think it's just something that varies per person, and each time the people that want the longer stuff, they might complain, and then the people that don't, it feels like we've been down this path so many times now. I'm almost like feeling tired of it. I'm just like.
Well, honestly though, absolutely, there's a lot of people out there who just don't have a huge amount of time to play games, right? And the concept of what you might call a shorter game is actually highly welcome. I think it's actually one of the reasons why Switch is so popular across a whole spectrum of gamers, regardless of age. It's simply because it's so immediate, and so the concept of the Switch is that you can just pick up, play, and put it down again. And, it doesn't demand huge amounts. Just the whole format of the system just doesn't make demands on your lifestyle. It kind of fits in where needed. And, maybe it's so, I think it's okay to have what you might call smaller games in terms of their length. But it doesn't necessarily, how long it takes to complete a game doesn't define how much longevity a game has. I would argue.
That's super important, Rich.
Yeah. I think having said that, from what I've played of Hellblade 2, I'm not in any particular rush to go back and replay.
No.
Do you know what I mean? Maybe it's something I'll do like, a year or 2 years from now.
Yeah.
But certainly not in the immediate future. But on the flip side, the vast majority of people that are going to be playing it will be on Game Pass, right?
Right.
So it becomes less of a relevant
it's basically perfect for that. I think it's great for that kind of service, because it means more people can experience it without needing to worry about the length. They'll just give it a shot, right?
Yeah, I think Hi-Fi Rush went through the same thing, it being a 10-hour game or so. Again, perfect for Game Pass. And I can only echo what you've said, is that there's a difference between me at my teenage years and me in my adult life. Teenage years all over JRPGs, because you buy the game for, was it £40 back then? And you thought, well, I'm going to get 30, 40, maybe more hours out of Final Fantasy VII. And then today I'm like, gosh, getting back home from work, I just want to get something complete, And so the priorities have changed, but I do respect people who want to have more. And, even if they, if that means having optional extras to go and do and explore in a game, that's great. But it's that stuff isn't for me.
I mean, Rich, what you alluded to earlier is interesting, because I think back to a lot of retro stuff that's like an hour long or less. Whether it's shooters, whether it's just like, classic platform games. Those are some of my favorite games to play, and I've been playing them for years and years and years and years. The length doesn't matter there at all, because it's so replayable, and just playing it is fun. But in cases like Hellblade, because it is sort of a cinematic experience, I look at it more like buying a copy of a film and putting it on your shelf, and you might watch it every 2 or 3 years, maybe, if you really enjoyed it. I think that's perfectly fine. There's value there.
Really a dark film that maybe made you a bit uncomfortable to watch, but you think, I'll watch that sometime in the future.
Yeah, it's yeah.
Let's round off with this question from Eric Benoit. Hello, DF crew, John and Richard. Would playing Hellblade 2 on the Sony FW900 be as insanely awesome as I could imagine? For those who don't know, the FW900 is basically the greatest CRT monitor ever made, judged by a lot of people. John?
I think this is a game that it would look good on there, of course, but it's not because, well, maybe on PC more so, but because of all the heavy post-processing, motion blur, you're going to not really be seeing the super advantages of the CRT, especially with motion clarity, right? Like the whole thing is that these things can do basically flawless motion, and a 60 FPS game or higher on a CRT like that is mind-blowingly beautiful and smooth. But for this, with a slower pace, lower frame rate, at least on console, all the blurry effects, I actually think it's still better on something like a big OLED or any TV with really good HDR.
Yeah, HDR. Yeah. I mean, when you think about the advantages of CRT, it's not really the game that's going to bring out those advantages, like ultra fast input response. It's just not that game.
Right.
And of course, no HDR. That's that's a big miss, I'd say. I guess that's all we've really got to say about Hellblade 2 for now. I'm going to be interested to see how the discourse sort of continues over time with this one, because it does have much in common with other titles that were mentioned earlier by DF Enjoyer there, like Rise, Son of Rome, and The Order 1866. And I would actually say that the perception of those games has actually improved, almost exponentially over time. People are kind of genuinely looking back at those with some degree of nostalgia, simply because they were standout games, but not as games.
So both of those, especially Rise, I'd say, have a lot more like core gameplay moments in it, right? Like Rise is largely a game where you are mostly controlling your character. It's just a bit repetitive, but the experience is still good. I liked it back in the day. That was one of the earliest like big titles that I ever covered on DF, actually. So I have a lot of fondness for that game.
Absolutely. Okay, with that, let's move on to our next news topic. It's not often that Digital Foundry is a part of the news. Well, maybe that's not strictly true. But this week we were caught up in the deal that Gamer Network, well, rather, Reed Exhibitions, who owned Gamer Network, has now sold out to IGN, which means that essentially, well, Digital Foundry is a joint venture between Gamer Network and, well, me. And what this means is that IGN essentially has bought Gamer Network and therefore has bought the shares that Gamer Network has in Digital Foundry. And I mean, the issue here is that the acquisition was announced in tandem with the announcement that there'd be a number of layoffs within Gamer Network, even before the integration into IGN has begun. A lot of questions, obviously, people are having about the extent to which Digital Foundry may be affected or may be changed. And it's a tricky one because going into this, I was actually quite looking forward to this announcement going out. And that might sound quite bizarre to many, bearing in mind the discourse this week, but let me explain. Gamer Network was acquired by an events company, Reed Exhibitions, Reed Pop. And over the, first couple of years seemed okay, but it kind of quickly became evident that Reed Pop wasn't really fully invested in the gaming websites. There was little interest in actually growing them. And to all intents and purposes, Gamer Network was left to its own devices with a strictly limited series of resources, which limited what the firm could do to adapt in a fiercely competitive and dynamic market. And so I was quite looking forward to this acquisition being announced because, well, IGN is owned by Ziff Davis. They're fully committed to the gaming market. And the amount of resources and talent they have behind the scenes is actually hugely empowering for a very small outfit like Digital Foundry, right? And over the years, IGN has been, very complimentary about our work. And, in pre-sale discussions, it was clear that they had a lot of enthusiasm for what we were doing. It's very difficult to communicate that when we're actually seeing a lot of our colleagues at Gamer Network laid off. And it really sort of was a massive downer because, a lot of good people are losing their jobs. It's never great. Mm-hmm. And what it means is that we're going into this acquisition with a kind of, into this transition rather, with a lot of fear and uncertainty about what's going to happen to the brands. And this is kind of reflected in some of the questions we had. So let's go through them in turn. This one from Generative Alcoholism. John said on Twitter that DF would be quote unquote better as a result of the IGN acquisition. Can you elaborate on why this is the case? Yeah, I had a word with you about that, John, because, it was kind of like, it is actually true.
Yes.
But when you're facing this massive amount of discourse about people losing their jobs and consolidation in the industry, stuff like that, it certainly is sort of seems a bit discordant. But the fact is, as I
yeah.
just said, we were the Digital Foundry shares owned by Gamer Network were essentially controlled by an events company that weren't best equipped to deal with the games business. Ooh. So, basically what's happening now is that outfit has been replaced by one who is fully committed to the games business. And that does have, potentially exciting implications for Digital Foundry, right? I don't think there's too much more to add to that. Is that what you meant, John?
That's exactly what I meant, which is we were basically being limited by the prior company, right? They didn't really have an interest in us. They didn't really invest a lot of time, effort, money into us. We just kind of did what we could and got by. But I feel like this at least gives us a shot at getting actual support from a company that's like in this space rather than just like being in a side thing. Because I mean, it's obviously Repop kept the EGX stuff, right? They kept the event stuff for themselves.
They've kept the events,
which to me, it always seemed like that's what they wanted in the first place. They took all the other sites along with them, but they only wanted the events. And then when the pandemic happened, we saw the true, the reality of the situation. Although I would argue that having digital business probably helped a lot during that time period when they couldn't have events. So I don't know. It's just, I didn't feel that positive about the prior company, shall we say. And at least this stands a chance of improving things and allowing us to do more of what we want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is fundamentally the case. This question from Gian. Hey DF team, exclamation point. Will the acquisition of Gamer Network by IGN have any impact on DF? Which is a really good question, right? Because obviously there was this kind of wave of negativity that accompanied the announcement of the acquisition. And that's going to be the first thing that people are going to be asking if they're particularly invested in what we do. And, have any impact? I'm hoping it will only be positive impact simply because we will have a partner that actually understands games for once and really is invested in what we do. But I think it's fair to say that, the buyout has happened. We've only had like very limited discussions with the management there about what their plans are, but we certainly don't have any sort of wish to change what we are, who we are, and how we do it, because I think that would be counterproductive to all people concerned.
Exactly.
For sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
If you're going to spend this massive amount to acquire Gamer Network and by extension a chunk of Digital Foundry, you, in theory, want that to grow and prosper.
Yeah.
As opposed to, the opposite.
And that is just a chunk, like you said. They don't have full ownership of DF. So
that's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's a partnership more than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Which again sort of makes the case for independence a lot sort of stronger. This question by Leftist Hominid. Does the acquisition mean that Wheel's DF adaptations will appear on IGN? Also, does this increase the probability that DF folks will be invited onto IGN podcasts more often? For example, John has been on Nintendo Voice Chat before. What's Nintendo Voice Chat? A podcast, I assume, John?
Yeah, it's one of the IGN... it's a Nintendo-related podcast, as the name would imply. So I was on there talking about Xenoblade, I believe, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, if I recall.
Well, we've done collaborations in the past, and there's no reason why we can't do more of them. The issue is always time and bandwidth, of which we have vanishingly small amounts. So, in terms of where DF content appears, that nothing has been formally agreed yet, so I can't really say anything on that front. Just have to wait and see. This one from Alan, the legendary Alan on the Discord. Hi DF team, I'd like to address the elephant named IGN in the Foundry. I know Richard doesn't like to talk about corpos, and it isn't a fair to ask. Corpos. Exclamation point. However, in the last few days, while grazing the gaming community pastures, I've seen a lot of worried people in comments. One even claimed, quote unquote, "This is the death of DF!" Exclamation point. Are you able to put us Foundrians' minds at ease? Well, sure, because ultimately, if things aren't going the way we want them to go, we can always leave.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the bottom line. But it's not in the interests of anybody for that to happen, right? And ultimately, we just want a really strong partner that can enable us to do more and do better. And given the choice between ReadPop and IGN, it's a bit of a no-brainer.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of actual positives to this. It's just really disappointing that in tandem with the announcement being made was the announcement that a lot of people in Gamer Network are going to be losing their jobs. And to be clear, nobody at Digital Foundry is affected by that. It's just really sad that people are losing their jobs.
This is my feeling mainly. It's only been a couple of days since the announcement internally. Went into the day thinking this is going to be all smiles, all roses, but the layoffs have been quite a shock, especially internally. I work at the office here in Brighton, and yeah, it's been quite a tough few days. And I won't name names and talk about the people affected specifically, but they will have made themselves known on Twitter, and I really just wish them all the best for the future.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Also, he uses the word corpo, which is funny, but like Relics and all that whole thing that we were a part of, they're a lot bigger than Ziff Davis in terms of overall number of employees. It's a bigger company.
Yeah.
Like Relics itself is listed as having 36,000 plus employees. That's not small.
And not many of them to do with gaming.
No, not at all. So we're coming from a really big corporate entity to a still corporate but smaller entity.
Yeah, and the extent of the influence that they can have is necessarily limited because they don't have full ownership of the business. So I'd just like to put it out there that, as far as we're concerned, it's business as usual. We're going to continue doing what we're going to be doing. Our staff lineup remains the same. And, the whole atmosphere right now is really, quite sad and despondent.
Yeah,
But there are, certainly where we're heading, I'm hoping it's in a positive direction with that level of partnership involved. That's all we've got to say about that, really, because we haven't even officially met the IGN leadership yet.
It's true.
Which happens next week, and we should have more of an idea on what they want to bring to the party at that point, which potentially should be pretty good. I mean, it's no secret that people have been fully aware of the limitations of ReadPop in the gaming business, and that's the reason why Gamer Network lost so many staff over the last few years, most of them to IGN, oddly enough, and Vox Media, of course. And so it's kind of weird that a lot of our old colleagues are now colleagues again.
We're rejoining them,
which is actually quite fantastic. But yes, business as usual for now, and going forward, there should only be good things, and I'll leave it at that. Okay, next news topic. Well, this one's quite interesting because Tom was without project this week, so he decided to circle back and take a look at some of the games that have appeared that may or not have received full Digital Foundry coverage, but might have been quite interesting to take a look at, because sometimes you see a story there. Now, Tom, TopSpin 2K25, you took a look at that.
Yes.
And what's the story there? I mean, basically it's quite weird, isn't it? Because going back a few generations, tennis games were actually huge on consoles.
Yeah.
They're now all but
tennis.
extinct. Yeah.
Oh, R.I.P. Yeah, God, I miss that wave, and somehow we've lost that in recent generations, especially last generation. A major tennis game, a real tentpole release that rallies, if you like, all the fans of the sport and gets them playing something that's genuinely high quality. TopSpin 4. Back in 2011 was that game on PS3 and 360. People still love it. It's a fan favorite of the series. If you liked sim-based, more simulation-style tennis games, where Virtua Tennis would be the more arcade side of things. So cut forward 13 years, and we've got a follow-up finally from, I guess, partially the original developers, 2K Czech, who worked on TopSpin 4. They have since merged into Hangar 13, and Hangar 13, of course, known for the Mafia 3 and the Mafia remake from 2020. So what I understand is in their interviews with WCCFT Tech, they are working from a proprietary engine, Hangar 13's proprietary engine. And so that points to a whole range of tech which likely overlaps with Mafia's. Not 100% confirmed, but there's a lot of hints in the way the game looks, especially the global illumination of these that's used on the across the characters and across the courts to spill light back up on the characters as you walk around, as the players sort of run around, and especially in shaded areas. So there is some good stuff in here, but it is their first real run at this genre in 13 years. And so it's not, I guess it's the first stab, and just like a pitch to tennis fans everywhere to say, do you want more of this? And here's our first attempt. There's things that I don't like. Character models, they look not great. They don't look very true to life.
I'm looking at your footage. I do recognize Roger Federer.
You do recognize Roger Federer. And Roger Federer is at least motion captured officially. They got all his movements implanted into the game, and so he'll look the most authentic of the bunch. There's a good sized roster in there, but the thing is that they had to, first of all, Andy Murray doesn't look anything like he does in real life. His hair is so so full and luscious, and he looks just a whole different facial design. But it is it's a solid first effort. It is a last gen game, I think, that has been scaled up to new consoles, and so the exciting bits about playing on PS5, Series X and S are limited, I think, but it does mean every console runs at 60 frames per second. And they all cap at 30 FPS in cutscenes. And one thing I did find that was quite interesting is that the resolution differences between the current gen systems are not what you'd expect. It's 1440p native on PS5. It's 1620p native on Series X. Series S, 1080p. And I dipped into the older base last gen consoles, the base Xbox One, the One S actually, and that came at 900p. And we can deduce that base PS4 probably runs at 1080p. So yeah, weird difference between PS5 and Series X, 1440p versus 1620p, but every other setting is a match. Series S drops the settings in global illuminations and shadow coverage, but otherwise it's great. It works, runs great. And if you're going last gen, you're really taking a few cuts and hits to visual quality there. And the GI is nerfed again, along with some geometric bits on the court side. But yeah, so that's my sort of tech analysis in a bite-sized summary.
I guess the big question is, Tom, on the Xbox version, did the XSN banner return?
XSN?
Yeah, XSN, Xbox Sports Network. That was part of the original TopSpin. It was during the early Xbox Live days, and when they were trying to promote like online play for sports games, they had the XSN. Right?
Of course. It was a big deal for Xbox, the original Xbox.
Heck yeah, it was.
One of the first.
TopSpin was part of the XSN, baby.
Man, that brings back memories. Thank you for that, John.
I'm looking at your footage. I do think those 30 FPS cutscenes are unforgivable.
That was
simply unforgivable.
They did the same thing in all the Virtua Tennis games as well. Yeah, it's just like a thing that they always do in tennis games for some reason.
Yeah.
30 FPS is. I'm sure they could have done a lot better with the cutscenes. There's nothing to justify it either. It's not like the resolution jumps up or anything. It stays at 1622p on the Series X no matter what. So there might be a dynamic component to it, but it stays where it stays mostly.
I think you've just justified the Xbox power narrative.
Oh no.
1620 versus 1440p.
Yeah, man.
Well done, Tom. Well done.
There's I've unleashed all hell on the comments.
What about the game? Do you think it's good?
Well, I'm a huge tennis fan, and I loved TopSpin 4. I love Virtua Tennis, as I think a lot of us did growing up with the Dreamcast and the later games as well. Got a particular fondness for Virtua Tennis 1 and 2, but TopSpin 3 and 4 were the games I played with my brother quite a bit, and it's for the more... someone after a more simulation experience, meaning you don't just press X or square to hit the ball, and that's that. You hold it and release it to an exact timing. And you'll see in like the footage that there's a very slim window where you can get a perfect shot with like the green bar at the end. And how quickly your gauge goes across and how difficult it is to time getting a green perfect shot is based on your positioning. And the great thing about this game is they've got John McEnroe, going through a lengthy tutorial, which they really recommend you take part in right from the game start, just to understand the basics of tennis and how to reposition yourself after hitting a shot, going back to the center back of the court and avoiding being sort of at an awkward angle for when a ball hits the floor and bounces back up again. You want to be kind of halfway, torso height. So all this stuff plays into how quickly that gauge goes across. Fatigue also plays a part, and a bunch of other factors. But yeah, so it's very well done in that respect. It takes a bit of getting used to. It's a little bit more stiff because your players actually have to accelerate from the spot, and they're a bit sluggish to start. And that means you have to start running in a direction you suspect your opponent will be firing at. But yeah, so it is... there's value to playing Virtua Tennis even today if you want something a bit more immediate. But if you want something a bit more in-depth, this is the game for you. Early days again, though, it's still missing a lot of stuff. Djokovic and Nadal are absent, but might come in a future update. So
Tom, if you're somebody like me that really only likes Virtua Tennis, is it worth giving this a shot? Or is it just like did they go too deep on the sim aspect?
I think it's more sim than, it's quite...
Okay.
Yeah, if you're a tennis fan, this is great. But I still think it might struggle to appeal to a wider base of players. That's my honest opinion. And I say that like through gritted teeth because I want more people to buy it, and so there'll be a new one. But that's just kind of... they do their best to onboard you, though, with the tutorials.
John, Super Tennis. Need I say more?
Oh yeah, Super Tennis.
The game.
That's good. That was good. But what about Power Serve 3D Tennis for the PlayStation with the spinning ball cam? That was great. Where like oh my god, that we covered that in the PS1 launch episode, but like that literally has camera angles where like the camera locks to the tennis ball and it continuously rotates in 360 degrees around the ball. That is one of the camera angles.
Oh, Christ.
Sort of like bullet time.
Yeah, but like not slow. So imagine trying to play a tennis game with the spinning ball cam.
That sounds remarkable.
I don't think it is playable.
I don't think it is.
No.
Yeah. No, that's...
Okay.
We need to see more tennis games. That's all I'll say. We need to see more. There aren't enough.
I'm going to be curious to see if this does actually do well and therefore warrants a follow-up, because it seems to me that in a sort of unexpected move, a punt has been taken here, a gamble to see whether there is actually a market for these type of games still. So I'm going to be curious to see if it will check out. Big announcements from Microsoft this week with the arrival of ARM-based Windows laptops. Now, obviously, back in the past when the Surface first launched, we had Surface RT based on an ARM version of Windows 8, I believe. And let's just say it wasn't particularly good, but things have moved on. The Qualcomm X Elite is a new processor, SoC, that's, they're talking about massive performance gains over Apple's new M4 chip. And, they're also talking about gargantuan battery life. Basically, it's almost as if, Satya Nadella has basically said that they're looking to compete on a more even terms with what Apple is doing with Apple Silicon. From our perspective, let's just put it this way: it's very AI driven, and I got to say, those features look interesting, but it's not massively compelling from my point of view. What I am curious about is the gaming performance, because what they're doing here is allowing you to run x86 apps on these new laptops by using an emulation layer, which is called Prism. And they're saying it's just as good, if not better, by some degree than the Rosetta emulation that's used by Apple Silicon to run x86 apps. But yeah, I'm just really interested to see what the gaming performance is going to be like. And we've seen Baldur's Gate 3, and I think Borderlands 3 was also shown running at reasonable frame rates. But obviously, you have no idea what the settings are. I think Tom Warren mentioned to me that Civilization was also a demo there. John, any thoughts about this?
Yeah, no, it's interesting to see them make this switch. It makes sense in terms of efficiency, battery life. I think it's been tough to compete with what Apple's doing in the laptop space lately, because the silicon is just very efficient and quite performant for what it is. And Intel and AMD and everything are great in the desktop space where you have large power budgets and, you're trying to push a lot of this. But on mobile side, obviously that comes with battery life reductions and other things in effect. And now by digging back in, so Microsoft's tried ARM-based Windows before, right? But it didn't exactly work out.
They were using like a Tegra 3, so it wasn't exactly performance.
No, and there wasn't anything like an emulation layer that was any good. In effect, nothing like that. So this is really an attempt to bridge that gap and make like normal PC apps still usable, including games, on this much more efficient mobile sort of chipset, which could mean very long battery life for laptops, which is great for Windows laptops. So, I mean, they quoted like in the 30 FPS range for Baldur's Gate 3, which for an emulation layer on a mobile chipset, that's pretty darn impressive. And I'd imagine a fair number of games should be quite playable, many at much higher frame rates, in fact. Which is excellent. So that could be useful for the stuff going forward. But you're right, Microsoft focused a lot on the AI side of things, which
there's a lot of controversy there. I think the thing that people are kind of riled up about is the recall feature. Where basically, this is quite remarkable. The system is essentially screenshotting you as you use your PC, and then basically feeding those screenshots into AI, so you can ask the AI about tasks that you've previously done, and then go back and find things easier and all of that kind of business. And I can imagine there's a lot of people out there that do not want background screenshotting happening.
It's basically a keylogger at this point. And just all the thing is, though, is like the idea is interesting in that it's essentially designed to do what Windows search already does, right? Where you type in a thing and it finds the thing quickly. Although Windows search is still not excellent, I would say. But this takes it further by allowing you to search more contextually. Like if you remembered a part of a document or image or something that you may have looked at, you're like, oh gee, I don't know what the file name is. You can type in like a descriptor and it should be able to find it, is what they're promising. But and I almost wonder if part of the problem stems from the way they talked about it, like by being, I mean, it's good that they were open about what it is, but the way they phrased it and the way they talked about it made it sound pretty bad in terms of like privacy. Like, they tried to reiterate it doesn't send anything to Microsoft yet, but there's no plans to send data. I'm just saying, when you're capturing all that data, it just feels like if something goes wrong, something changes, it's not good. That's not necessarily good. That's not what people want. People do not want more intrusion into their OS lifestyle. But thankfully, at least for now anyway, it is limited to just these new machines with this new Qualcomm chipset, I believe. Like there is currently no x86 or whatever support, x64 support in there, right? So, but it sure seems like this is where they want to take Windows, and I don't know. I still feel like Windows 11, I've been using it for a while and it's fine, but it still feels like there's aspects of it that are actually degraded from prior Windows. They've just never fixed.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's just little things that it just feels like they're focusing on a lot of the wrong stuff sometimes. You're like, what are you guys doing? Like,
well, my take on this, before we talk about more gaming stuff and answer some supporter questions, my take on this is that it works. The approach Apple has taken works because they're all in on Apple Silicon, right? The entire macOS ecosystem is based on Apple Silicon, but Windows is still going to be serving both x86, x64, and ARM. And I'm just curious as to how effective this new sort of approach for ARM can be if you're not phasing out x86 support,
which they can't
because
do.
there's a lot of implications here, and it does extend to gaming. So obviously, if you're putting out an Apple Silicon version of a game, it's compiled in ARM, right? What's going to happen on Windows? Are we going to be using that emulation layer forever, or will game developers ship ARM executables as well as x86 executables? I'm not sure how all of this is going to pan out at the moment. Is this actually a transition, or is it like a new market sector just for this style of mobile device? I'm not entirely sure what they're aiming to do there, but it certainly looks mobile-based to begin with. Right?
And let's be honest, the track record of Microsoft taking these sort of side turns isn't great in terms of long-term support and success. Yeah. And you're right, by not going all in, which they shouldn't, the chances of this working are indeed reduced compared to Apple. I'm sure they would love to go all in if they could somehow turn the PC into this closed environment, but you can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? Windows is what it is, and it's too late. There's too many customers with too many broad use case scenarios that they can't become an Apple.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We got some supporter questions here. This one from Nua. Hi, people. Considering the recent push for ARM on Windows and how Qualcomm is pushing for gaming on the new Snapdragon X chips, do you think it would be possible in the future that it would be financially viable for ARM-based gaming laptops, considering people who buy gaming laptops mainly leave the charger on 24/7 and only care about performance? I'm not entirely sure about that. I think people have different needs. It's a bit of a generalized statement for an entire market segment. But it is interesting. And I think it's pretty great that, when you buy an Apple laptop, you don't really get degraded performance at all by removing it from the mains, because, the power draw is within the ability of the battery to deliver that level of power. And when you've got 175 watt NVIDIA GPUs going into laptops, that just isn't possible. To answer the question, though, I do think it is financially viable for ARM-based gaming laptops, and you can bet your bottom dollar that NVIDIA is going to be there. Oh, yeah. And this is actually one thing that slightly concerns me about the Qualcomm X Elite. We've seen with Intel Arc that drivers are so important for good gaming performance. We've also seen with Intel Arc that it's taking them years to get their drivers into a performance state, particularly on legacy games. So I can well imagine that Qualcomm are going to be facing exactly the same sort of scenarios with their GPU driver. Oh, yeah. Something going back to that Baldur's Gate demo, let's go to Act 3, Baldur's Gate the city, and see what it's performing like then, because that just annihilates CPU performance on a desktop and on a console. So how it's going to do on a laptop based on ARM, I'm really interested to see. So yeah, I have actually put in a pre-order for a new Surface laptop specifically because I really want to test the gaming credentials, assuming Microsoft can't supply one, or one of the other partner businesses. I think one of the great things about this endeavor, though, is that a lot of companies are seemingly following Microsoft's lead. It's not just like the likes of Dell, it's Asus, Acer, Lenovo. Everybody is producing Qualcomm X Elite based laptops. That's quite exciting. There does seem to be a proper momentum towards it. Next question, Alexander Seidel. Will the work done for Proton/Wine over the last 30 years be transferable to a similar translation layer on ARM? Would an ARM Steam Deck/Steam Machine be interesting to Valve in the foreseeable future? I think there's possibly two separate things there, because Proton is basically transferring Windows over, Windows commands over to Linux. It's still x86 based at heart, so it's not quite the same thing. Let's go on to this question from Dajar Ko, which is actually quite interesting, ties back to what we were talking about earlier. Further details have emerged on NVIDIA's AI PC SoC, as it is being called. Seems like it will be a range of SoCs with advanced packaging to bring together the ARM-based Cortex X5 Blackhawk CPU cores and the Blackwell RTX GPU cores, along with LPDDR6. Looks like Microsoft Prism will play a role, and presumably updates to Windows to enable the use of ARM CPUs to power their Copilot spec PCs and push them to clients. With Nvidia's share price just flying north of $1,000, previous news that it was going to be 3nm would seem consistent with their bullish mood. Could this be the beginnings of the next Xbox and their handheld, or just a spicy Steam Deck destroyer? Well, I think the concept of NVIDIA being able to compete again, in this particular market where they can't because they don't elsewhere because they don't have an x86 license, they're going to be extremely interested in pursuing that. The gaming side of things, though, and of course, they have got the driver support, which Qualcomm may or may not have. So that's going to be hugely compelling. But it's all going to come down to how good Prism is and how performant those ARM cores are. And, the question is still, a game's going to support native ARM executables or not? We just don't really know at the moment. Anything to add? Anybody? There's a lot going on here.
No.
No. Yeah, I mean, I think from a DF perspective, we really want to see what the Qualcomm X Elite can actually do. Maybe run some CPU tests, and try and get a handle on what overall sort of more holistic game support is across the generations of PC, across the various DXs and OpenGLs that we've seen. I'm really interested to see what it can do. With that, let's move on. Okay, so last week, Digital Foundry posted its Paper Mario: The 1,000-Year Door. I think that's right.
Yeah, that's
well
it.
Done.
Yep.
I was just thinking suddenly of 1,000-Yard Stairs for some reason. Posted our review, generally quite positive. There's still a good degree of discussion about the fact that a 60 FPS GameCube game runs at 30 FPS on Nintendo Switch, which is like several generations beyond, and decades on indeed. Tom, you wanted to talk about this because I'm looking at the docket here, and you've got various discussion points that have cropped up in the wake of the release of the game.
Yeah, 3 discussion points. One which stems from, well, 2 in fact, which stem from data mines of the game. Now it's fully released, and something we could not do. And the perennial source, Oatmeal Dome, on Twitter, has surfaced some interesting details about the engine that it's using. It's using the same engine as Paper Mario: The Origami King, which just, as a clarification to the review I did last week, it's for sure a remake in that case. It goes to a fundamental point of the game design where everything is rewritten and new assets are made, and they've pretty much built it from scratch. So it's a quite an incredible project, more incredible than I maybe gave it credit for in the tech analysis, but it's... And also, interestingly, scouring the Reset Era forums, there's people who've unlocked in the art gallery. There's unlockables as you play the game, concept art from early builds, and they have Mario in looking... Well, the design of Mario is similar to what it was in The Origami King. So they originally had a kind of an art style with a different coloured border around Mario, and the art style was more similar to that more recent game. So they clearly backtracked on that and made it a bit more distinctive to kind of make it stand out. So that's kind of point one. I don't know if you have any comments on that, it being based on that engine.
Well, there's a lot of sort of contention about what the nature of the game actually was, wasn't it? The Nintendo itself was kind of like sitting on the fence almost, in the fact it didn't refer to it as either a remake or a remaster, which I find quite fascinating.
Did they do that for the Metroid Prime remaster? Did they call it a remaster for Switch, or was it just Metroid Prime on Switch? I'm trying to remember.
Ooh. Well, we can do a quick Google, can't we?
Yeah. It seems to me like they might be a bit averse to that as a marketing thing, and they just want it to be presented as what it is.
They did just call it Metroid Prime Remastered.
Okay, cool. So not this time, apparently, but they really did. I looked everywhere through the press releases and thought, well, they really don't want to... I would have thought being called a remake would have advertised it more in a weird way, but...
I mean, it looks like a remake fundamentally, doesn't it? Because the graphics, fidelity, quality... everything has just been radically improved, which kind of is the form of the justification for why it's a 30 FPS game.
It's true. Yeah, very true. So I guess point two, we'll go to the other data mine point, which is that a line code has been discovered by Ribshark on Twitter about it running at 4K, or there's an option to run at 4K. And we discussed this on the Slack, and there's all sorts of reasons why a 4K option would be there. The most exciting one, obviously, being a Switch successor, but it could be used for anything like publicity shots. So, there's potential there. And
I guess my point would be, it's great to see that this sort of resolution is mentioned in the code, but has anyone actually managed to actually engage it? Does it work? Because, there's a lot of things that can just be in there, possibly for debugging purposes or, as you say, for bullshot production. And we've certainly seen some of that on Nintendo games. I mean, there's some Animal Crossing screenshots that came out with like phenomenally large resolutions.
It's also not a native 1080p game, right? So
it's true.
And they have 1080p in there, which makes me think it's more like a potentially useful in the future kind of front buffer thing, where they're just like, okay, depending on which display is attached, 720 for handheld, 1080p for Switch. And then if, for instance, this new machine is available, it could say, okay, set the front buffer to 4K. And it doesn't actually have anything to do with the rendering resolution, just the final output.
That rings more true. Looking at the screenshot, there's no mention of 900p or like, what would be the scale, 83% of 1080p. There's no mention of that. So, that's kind of where that is. Something to bear in mind. But the final point was that, of course, people have run this game with modified switches, and they've got it running at 60 frames per second with variable results. You found this YouTube video of it running kind of mostly at 60, but with dips to 40 FPS, 45 FPS in the first hub area, Rogue Port, which was, we don't know whether this capture is on stock clocks or if it's overclocked. You'd maybe hope that it would be just stock clocks and that you can overclock it to get better. But it shows perhaps why they didn't. They just settle for the 30 FPS cap, and it does have a similar sort of range to the Super Mario RPG remake. Even John looked at.
Oh yeah.
Where you kind of the justification there at the end of my video was, well, in an alternate scenario we would have had that situation with a lot of panning motion at 40 to 60 at points. So maybe the 30 FPS cap was the wiser choice, but I'm kind of loath to say that.
Well, we got this interesting question from supporter 1040 STF. If we trust some reliable sources of leaks, the Switch 2 was originally supposed to release in early 2024. Wouldn't the remake of Paper Mario have been one of its early launch titles then? Wouldn't that explain the 30 FPS cap on Switch? Well, I mean, possibly. John, did we ever hear anything about a release in early 2024? I seem to dimly recall.
Yes.
There was some panic from developers who just weren't ready.
Correct. We definitely heard a few things from different people. There was at least some sort of target they were working for in early 2024. Not necessarily hardware, but like, okay, we need to have such and such prepared for this around this time. Yeah, but obviously nothing official was ever announced, discussed. And so it wasn't a quote unquote delay, right? Just the potentially plans shifted at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of good reasons for that. But yeah, I mean, I do think we're probably going to be seeing sort of upgrade patches for Switch games.
I'd imagine so.
On Switch 2. I mean, it's just logical. It just makes sense. You know, when you look at the long tail of Nintendo Switch games, this is just another way to extend the lifespan of the existing library. I'm just kind of wondering how that strategy would sit with, you know, Nintendo's proven track record of basically enhancing older games, bringing them to new systems. I guess they can't repeat the same trick that they had with Wii U titles appearing on Switch. But you know, this is certainly some way to reignite interest in some legacy games. Anything more on this whole situation, Tom, or is that the full extent of it?
I think that is the full extent of it. Yeah, yeah. Interesting story though. I did. It's a great game and makes you wonder what it would have looked like. It will look like on Switch 2, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and with that, let's move on. Okay, next news topic. Well, not so much a news topic, more that Tom's been sort of circling back and taking a look at some other games, one of which is Ark Survival Ascended, which is basically an Unreal Engine 5 revamp of Ark, as far as I understand it. Tom, tell us more.
Yeah, for sure. We don't usually get to see this, and I went into this thinking it's a simple remake versus original comparison piece, and that'd be interesting enough. But what we've actually got is a game on console with a console command menu. I don't know if there are many games which can claim to have that, but I can't put a finger on any on PS5 or Series X. But what this gives you is the almost full suite of options you'd have on PC by hitting the tilde key on your keyboard, and you can connect a keyboard to your console, PS5 and Series X, and access it that way and type in all the commands that way. And I think the main point here is that the game opens out by default with no VSync, tearing across the screen. It looks hideous by anyone's standards. Runs at 30 to 35 FPS in the opening area. It runs at 1440p. The display port anyway is 1440p. I think it's native as well, 1440. And they're going full all-in with UE5 features. They've got the volumetric system for clouds, the fog. They've got dynamic global illumination, which looks great. And they're really trying to tick every box to say, hey, we've arrived with this.
Even nanite?
You know what? I'm not sure about nanite. I'm not sure. Not 100%. I'll have to look that up. It is obviously on the command console to enable and disable, but I didn't have any way to tweak any of that. But yeah, they're going hard on UE5 features, and as we've seen with a lot of UE5 games, doing a lot of this stuff actually gives you quite poor performance sometimes if it's not reined in a little bit. And really, this is a 30 FPS game. So I guess there are three things that are the sort of thing that I wanted to do is see if I could optimize it myself using this command menu. And I used PS5. I've sent Oliver a bunch of footage, maybe too much. Sorry, Oliver. And there is a three-pronged approach. Firstly, reducing the resolution. You've got an ability to enter a command for secondary display and enter a scale value. So at, say, 1440p, enter 50 at the end of that, you've got 720p. That seems to be the lowest point before you get diminishing returns on lowering the resolution. You can go to 540p or 360p if you like. You're really not gaining very much. It's going to look horrific. And I'm sure the footage bears that out. But yeah, you'll still be in the 50 to 60 FPS range, mostly at 50. So lowering the resolution on its own doesn't do much for the game. The second option, if you reset all of that and go back to, I should also mention, you can enable VSync very easily with a simple command line, and that gets rid of all the tearing. The other option is to reduce settings, and there's no granular controls, obviously. We don't have development tools here. We have just a command line to enable or disable or go between quality levels. So you can do that for shadows and disable shadows. So I try to peel back as many graphical settings while staying at 1440p to see if I could get to 60. And my God, it takes a lot to get there. So volumetric clouds, volumetric fog, gone. It's still not there. Getting rid of the dynamic, getting rid of the shadows entirely, still not there. The most substantial way to get there, though, is the fog and by getting rid of the dynamic global illumination, which seems to get you most of the way to 60, and then lowering the resolution again, you'll get all the way there. So too long didn't read. It's just a bit of a mess for getting it to 60. There's no real, at a core level, the density of the world design with all those foliage elements, the trees, everything's physics-based, like dinosaurs looming on the distance. It feels like there's no easy way for current PlayStation 5 hardware or Series X to really get over the line without more granular sort of draw distance controls. And this might be a prime candidate for a follow-up sort of mid-gen refresh just to see how it runs on there.
PS5 Ultra Boost mode. I'm quite looking forward to this in a world where you're not able to get 60 frames per second, 360p.
360p. Oh my
1920.
God.
I'm just looking at the footage here. 1920 by 1080 target, 33% scale, 360p. And 54 FPS.
It's for that retro look.
Starting to look at that original Switch port.
Well,
yeah.
Well, that's the thing, right? They actually put a lot of effort into the revamped Switch version.
Yep, they sure did.
And yet we seem to be back to square one with this.
So who handled this version then?
I don't know. You'd think it would be the original developer, possibly?
Because
it's a mixture of developers.
Really?
But yeah, well, they have different studios on different versions.
Exactly.
They outsource different parts of it. But yeah, it's definitely not. There's no foresight, and I think if this is the worst case of a developer leaving it to the user to optimize their game for them, literally have not.
Is it actually really apparent to the user that you can do this, or is it just like a thing that happens if you have a keyboard attached?
Oh, it is actually an option in the settings menu. You go, and then there's a toggle. Do you want the command?
So there is encouragement from the developer here to use this.
A tiny bit, yeah. There it is there. And if you're not bothered to do all that, there are mods. There's a whole mod section built into the game's front end just to let you access other people's attempted optimization of the game, which is... Okay. Yeah, bizarre.
Right. The Switch one was done by Grove Street Games, remember?
Yeah, of GTA Definitive Edition.
Which that wasn't great, but they did good on revamping Ark.
They did.
I assume they did not work on... Wait.
What?
They might have contributed to Ark Survival Ascended as well.
Okay, so Tom, final thoughts on this particular escapade?
There's no ideal way to optimize this game for PS5 or Series X if you're doing a DIY approach, but I guess if it is meant to be a 30 FPS experience, you have one final last ditch sort of option, which is a 30 FPS cap, easy enough to put into the command line there, and the snag is really that it's got uneven frame pacing, so
brilliant.
As if it couldn't get much worse. It's almost, I don't know which. It's like pick your poison.
Well, I'll tell you what. I mean, this would have been a fascinating live stream.
Yeah,
just get the audience involved, trying out different settings. It would have been quite an interesting experience.
I should have done another. I need a new episode of John Plays or whatever.
Yeah, John versus
John versus
Ark.
My worst nemesis.
Yeah, it's Yeah, it looks terrible no matter what you do with it in the command line, and it's just a shame because there's actually a decent looking game beneath it, but we just need better hardware to get it over the line, or just more of an effort from the developer to kind of tweak its visuals.
Well, they did it on Switch, so I don't see why this is such an issue for PS5.
The way I always put it is like 60 FPS, for instance, it's a design choice, right? We've had 60 FPS games going back to the 70s. If they're making a game and they know what the platform is and it runs like this badly, I don't think there's any excuse. I think that's just bad engineering, bad decisions made by the development team. I would say they did a poor job. And I mean that, it shouldn't have been released like this. And we've seen it with the Switch as well. Like the Switch,
that's like virtually every version of Arc.
I think Arc is just a mess overall. Only that Switch version kind of that revamping of the Switch version was probably the most impressive thing I saw. But that forced them to go back and squeeze every little bit out of it to get a reasonably playable game on that machine. But it seems like every other release of this game, still, it's always super sloppy. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's pretty bad. I mean, whew.
Yeah, one to return to. If we could turn this into some sort of benchmark, that'd be amazing. There's a lot. I think
you could. I think the nature of the game is slightly problematic, though, because isn't it quite dynamic?
Yeah, thinking about that, you can boot the game and it's more or less the same time of day every time. I did this a bunch of times because it got to night and I thought, well, it's not a fair test anymore to change the resolution and all that. So there is a way to kind of make it, standardize it. So we'll see.
Okay, good stuff. Now let's move on to supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show which, as ever, every week I put a post up on our Patreon asking our supporters for their input into the show, whether that's topic or questions for the team. We get a huge amount of comments, as you've seen from previous topics that we've talked about this week. Bunch of questions too, and I'm going to start off with this one from Roman Arathea Mikala. Hello, DF team. How do you feel about forced settings that are supposed to make a game more cinematic? Settings like forced aspect ratio, motion blur, film grain, lens dirt, etc. Personally, I hate them and think they should be optional, even if it will go against a developer's vision as part of accessibility best practices. Thanks for your amazing work and have a great day / week / month / year. I mean, we could go on, but he doesn't. It ends at year. So, all bets are off for 2025. But I'm going to go to you on this one, John. This is an interesting point, which I'm presuming arises in the wake of Hellblade 2, which does have a number of features fully engaged on the PC version where you're not permitted to remove them, though you can via mods.
I think this is going to be a game-by-game thing, but in the case of something like Hellblade, I think like that's genuinely part of the artistic vision that they want for this game, because in this specific case, they are trying to simulate the look of a very specific type of lens, right? Like the whole idea is that you're viewing this through this sort of lens, and all the distortions and everything about it is all part of that. And it's not just graphics for graphics' sake. Like that's part of the look of the game. And I feel like getting rid of it alters that too much. So in that case, that's tricky. Like in these extreme cases, I can see the purpose of not having an option. But in most cases, I think it should be optional because it's usually not necessarily part of like the core like identity of the game's visuals in the way like it is with Hellblade. But I think in most cases it should be optional because, like he says, some people just can't stand it. There are those that even have potential accessibility issues, headaches, whatever, eye strain from the blur, I guess. I used to be more into wanting to force a specific type of visual look for certain games, but I've kind of softened on that. And I understand there's just a wide range of opinions out there as to the way something looks, and, more customization, the better.
Okay, Tom.
agree. Fully on board with John's point about accessibility options in the vein that there should be options in case people have a difficulty with, say, motion blur or certain types of visual effects, chromatic aberration. That's fair enough. I think that should be all open to the user, but at the same time, there is such a range. I mean, a developer will pick its mark in terms of, okay, we want the game to look like Toy Story, so it's going to have a certain look to it. We want the game to look like, a cartoon, so we're going to make it cel-shaded. These are stylistic choices that they make at the start of the game's production, and they commit hard to it. And in Hellblade's case, you've got a game that really wants to look like a film, and the type of lens that it uses plays a huge part in that, and simulating the lens type plays a huge part in that. I mean, films even do the same thing. If a film shot in digital, they'll go back in and simulate film grain and all the things that are part of traditional 35mm reels. We're in an era today. I mean, Dune and Dune 2, the latest versions of that film, do that. They have kind of artificially, they add in film grain via a different process to a digital original shot. So yeah, it's about style, and I think there is value to having a range of visual styles in video games, some of which may appeal, some which won't. My pet peeve, I'll be honest, is aspect ratios which don't align with my screen in games, but I can see its use. I think there's a place for it.
It used to be more annoying if you played like that on, like, say, an OLED, or sorry, an LCD TV. That was often bad, because in the black area is just glowing backlight. But I feel like that's on true, modern OLED screens with the perfect black level, it looks pretty darn good, where it just, like, basically it just looks like a thicker bezel. There's no visible image in that space.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm highly conflicted about this, because I think the nature of the PC platform is that to a certain extent the developer has to let go of the reins and hand it back to the user. There's so many different variations of PC hardware. There's a certain expectation level from the PC users about the options that they, could change. I think it's quite different from a sort of, the closed shop that is the console arena. And, stuff like chromatic aberration, I think, it's perfectly fine to disable that without compromising the director's vision, so to speak. The question is really about getting the balance right, I guess. I guess at the end of the day, though, Hellblade seems to be a particularly moddable game because it is based on Unreal Engine. Fairly sure the Unreal Engine unlocker works on it, but I'm looking at Nexus mods, and all of the mods that I'm seeing to tackle stuff like this just seem to be changing elements of the .ini file. And, you can get your 16:9 aspect ratio if you want it. You can deliberately disable chromatic aberration. So options are still there. It's just, sort of like one step removed. It's not too difficult, but, maybe the developer could have been a bit more open to that. Okay.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the next question. This one from Inebriated Porcupine. Hey DF, thanks for all the excellent content! I wanted to ask about the frame rate limiting and Ghost of Tsushima's PC port. Nix's PC ports are justifiably lauded as the best of the best, but even they do not have a frame rate limiter in the options menu. They do allow for users to set a target frame rate using upscaling, but the game will happily go to higher frame rates if no upscaling is needed, which in turn results in uneven performance throughout the game. E.g., my rig gets 60 to 90 FPS, but I would prefer a stable 60 to a 60 to 90 FPS scale depending on the scene. Should a frame rate cap be added to the game's options, and if so, why do you think Nixis have omitted it? Well, you can limit frame rate on Ghost of Tsushima, I believe, simply by turning on VSync, right? That would solve the problem. And I think there's like half-rate VSync options and maybe even third. I'm not quite sure about that. But there is a frame rate cap in there, and it's called VSync. Yep. And yeah, that basically gives you a frame rate limit. However, equally, I'm aware that there is... we live in a world where most PC monitors have, FreeSync or G-Sync. And, basically, maybe there should be an arbitrary cap that the user can introduce that sets the frame rate to a more consistent level, because it isn't really an option in any PC game, or very, very rare, certainly. I'm curious what you think about this, John, because you do a lot of PC gaming these days on a high refresh rate display. Are you happy with just sort of fluctuating frame rates? Would you prefer a cap? And if so, is it something that should be in like a tool like Riva Tutor that you're happy to set up on a per game basis, or would you prefer it to be in the game itself?
Well, if you're on a high enough end system, I think it's perfectly. I'm totally happy with just having fluctuating frame rates combined with VRR, and I feel like most PC gamers are going to be using some sort of VRR screen at this point. If you're not, then I mean, there's already a lot of VSync options for handling this, both inside and outside of games. That you just half refresh VSync, for instance. Those options have been around for a long time. Just arbitrarily setting a frame rate limit. I mean, without VRR, you wouldn't want an arbitrary frame rate. It would just be the same. You would want whatever VSync already would do, right? Like if you were on if you're running at 60 hertz, you wouldn't want to set the frame rate to 50 frames per second, because that would just look ugly.
No, but hold on. Let's say you've got like 120 hertz, 144 hertz screen, but the game is sort of fluctuating between 60 to 70.
Right.
Surely it would be cool just to be able to limit it to 60 so you get that consistent response.
I don't think it really makes that much of a difference, visually speaking, or in terms of response. 60 to 70 is going to look about the same as just locked 60 when you're running it in VRR, right? It really only matters if you're running on a non-VRR screen, in which case you want to lock it to a multiple the refresh rate. And that's really, really that simple, I think.
I think one scenario where I think there is slightly more demand for a frame rate cap is I tested out a 4K 240 hertz screen. And then what happens is you have scenes that sort of vary between like 90 to 240 depending on the complexity of the scene. And that is a bit off-putting. To the point where I would advocate a frame rate cap, at whatever the sort of, more, something more closer to the median frame rate, as it were.
Yeah, like 90 to 120 might work better.
Yeah, so that's something.
I mean, I think what he's thinking about and what would be the best solution, and I'm not even sure it's possible in Windows, is what the Steam Deck does. Right. Because that does not use a VRR screen, but it has that little like pop out menu where you can just set your maximum refresh rate basically, and it alters the screen to match that. And it's godlike. Like you can put it to whatever the heck you want, any arbitrary frame rate in that range, and it's just going to alter the refresh rate, and bam, it just works. And it looks amazing. I think is the solution. But again, I'm not sure that that's really possible in Windows. Probably possible in Windows itself, but it's more like the variety of hardware and drivers that makes that difficult to implement properly. So,
yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I do think there is an argument for exactly what Nixis is doing with its games when you have a VSync situation involved, where you can actually lock it to multiples of the screen. Your 30s, your 60s, even your 120s, because there are displays out there that are high refresh rate without variable refresh rate support, unbelievably. That HP laptop I looked at recently was one of them. That kind of makes sense. But yeah, I kind of get what you mean, that there are sort of more limited scenarios once you've got VRR involved. Any thoughts on this one, Tom?
No more, no.
Okay, fair enough. Good. Let's move on to the next question. This question's from Very Professional Dodo. Hello there, gents. I come with a question about quote-unquote future compatibility because I think we might have seen one of the best examples of this in console history, with Starfield and Fallout 4 receiving the ability to play at 4K unlocked in visuals mode. Unfortunately, though, this is the exception, and I believe console manufacturers and developers underestimated the power of good future compatibility in the past. How many people would instantly upgrade from PS4 to PS5 if they could play Bloodborne at 4K 30 or 1440p 60 without needing any more developer intervention? This would invariably shift some of the onus from the developer to the user to toggle the right setting, but it would still be transformative while also maximizing future console sales as well. An alternative route route would be the platform holder having the possibility to override settings at an API level and take matters into their own hands. This would probably be best, since it's clear that A, some developers don't think about next-gen hardware, and B, even if they did, they couldn't possibly anticipate the capabilities of future hardware with any degree of accuracy. Thoughts? Just before I hand this over to you guys, just to explain what's happening in Starfield and Fallout 4 but basically they give you two toggles, right? You can select the frame rate target, which can be 30, 40 or 60 or uncapped in the case of Starfield. But then you can also select between visuals and performance mode. Visuals has like higher fidelity settings and a higher resolution. So yeah, it's basically on Starfield a better situation with current hardware to set the game to performance mode with a 60 FPS target, because visuals mode is too demanding in a lot of content. But at the same time, that option is there. So if a more performant piece of hardware comes along in the future, you can actually select that and get the best of both worlds. So what do you think about this concept of future compatibility, John?
I think it works to some extent, and we've seen it before. I was thinking back to the original BioShock, if you recall, which had a VSync off toggle. I believe you did. So that kind of thing. And what you just mentioned there, what Fallout, Starfield do, perfectly reasonable. But he specifically mentions Bloodborne at 4K 30 or 1440p 60. And I think the problem there is that developers couldn't really implement any settings that wouldn't work on the current hardware.
Yeah.
Right? Like even if they were not performant, like they would still need to work.
Yeah, there's a memory issue.
Yeah.
There's like 5 gigs of memory available to the base PS4. Developers aren't going to sort of put aside the memory required for a 4K frame buffer when that memory can be used more prodigiously elsewhere.
And also it's just
True.
They can't necessarily guess what future APIs might be or how they would even like open themselves up to it. Or what about the consoles themselves? Like I assume when it's running on a PS5, it's like running in that PS4 kind of sandbox, right? So it wouldn't necessarily have more resources unless
it depends on the game.
Yeah, but it has to be patched to access that stuff.
The best option would be an uncapped frame rate.
Yeah, but I'm just talking about adding things like increased resolution or whatnot.
Yeah,
this is it.
That stuff I don't think would be easy to do. You'd have to, I think, to make that work, you'd have to approach it more like Microsoft did with its backwards compatibility stuff. Where it's boosting res on 360 titles and original Xbox titles. It'd have to be done outside the game.
Another great example of what you could call accidental future compatibility, I think it was Wolfenstein, the New Colossus, which had a DRS setting. It was basically, the upper bounds was 4K, but then you could basically swap between native dynamic resolution or aggressive dynamic resolution, which basically lowered the bounds and allowed for higher frame rates. But, going back to Xbox One X, which, had that option, it wasn't a particularly great experience at native 4K. But when Series X comes along, out of the box, you get native 4K 60, which is great, right? And Absolutely. A similar thing is happening with Starfield there. I do think maybe something could be done when developers could possibly think to themselves, well, let's think about what this game could be on more performant hardware and maybe offer an option for that, even if it's sort of buried within the options. What do you think, Tom?
I think there's definitely a distinction between a system in the future allowing older games to just run completely sort of free to hit the max frame rate target that's possible. But there's that, and then there's actually adding code and tweaking the game with a patch to enabling it to do so. I think the question from Very Professional Dodo is about the first case where it's kind of blind and the system at the receiving end, the future system, is just taking the software as is. And with that comes the issue of compatibility and unintended consequences of running the game in ways that it wasn't, higher resolutions, higher frame rates, let's say. things like in Dark Souls or Bloodborne, there might be issues with, the timings of attacks. If you suddenly have the game run at 60, if that was suddenly possible, if you were to force that at an API level, there may be issues with if you were to bump the resolution up arbitrarily on an older game, with the HUD suddenly not aligning correctly, or just, obviously the assets will be low resolution as well. They'll be made for a 1080p display in Bloodborne's case. So there's a few snags to doing it that way, but maybe the best route forward is to allow the option on a future console, but have a little sort of warning saying, use at your own, caution.
Well, the option being discussed here about having an override at the API level is essentially what FPS Boost did, but it was curated. It's precisely because it doesn't work on every game. And this did lead to some scenarios where they actually put out an FPS Boost mode that did cause issues, that made it through all of the checks and balances. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, for example, had a crash with FPS Boost, and it was resolved by an engineer leaving Square Enix, deciding, hey, I'm going to actually put together a proper unlock frame rate patch.
Weekend job.
I don't know how long that was, but it was the good thing to do, and it basically meant that an FPS Boost experience became a proper patch, properly validated, and they did a PS5 version as well. But yeah, I think I guess that's potentially the danger there, where you put in this this ability to consider future compatibility in the knowledge that it might not actually work, because you don't actually know what the hardware is and how it operates. But fundamentally, I do think there have been so many scenarios now where games that run with unlocked frame rates out of the box, or run with depressed performance, not hitting 60 frames per second, do hit 60 frames per second under back compat on a future machine.
True.
I do think
Very
there
true.
is something to be said for considering that in a game design.
I tell you what, I think it'd be good if most games going forward just included, similar to Starfield and Fallout 4, just a little checkbox hidden in the options to unlock frame rate. Say they've committed to 30. Just, it's not bothering anyone. It's purely at a user's discretion to use it. Like I'm thinking about a lot of Switch games coming out, like Paper Mario, for instance. I'd have liked to have seen the option just in case, just to make life easier in the future. But
okay, fair enough. And with that, let's move on to the next question. This one from Leftist Hominid. In the 9th gen, we have seen the return of screen tearing, and not maintaining 60 or 30 is far more common. Do you think that developers have started using VRR as a crutch instead of as a safety net? Last year, one of the greatest motivating factors for me to upgrade from an old budget TLC TV to an LG C2 was so that I could have access to VRR and 120 hertz on consoles. John, I'm not sure I fully agree with this idea that we're seeing the return of screen tearing.
I definitely do not. It's not very common.
There are scenarios where it does happen. We just saw one with Arc.
Yeah.
For sure, yeah.
But it seems to be much rarer than it was last generation, and certainly compared to the 360, the PS360 generation.
That was the generation of tearing.
But even so, I do think there are scenarios where you see games not hitting their performance targets, and certainly there is a very compelling argument to get a 120 hertz VRR screen. Anything to add to that?
So I actually was thinking about this recently, and I think for the first time since maybe kind of the PS2 generation, 60 FPS has kind of become the standard again. Wouldn't you agree? Like, if you look at most console games released, both big and small, like small as well, like 60 FPS just tends to be the typical target you see, which it hasn't been that way for a long time.
I'd say that's kind of becoming a bit more of a grey area as we're seeing.
Yeah, but only
games.
with some of these big demanding games, right? Like when I'm saying it's like a lot of the big games are 60, but also the medium range games are often 60, and especially you get into the more budget stuff, you pop in any random like piece of junk you found at like a Media Markt for $5 with some cartoon animals on it that's like nothing. guess what? It's probably going to run at 60. That was not the case for a long time.
Have you proven that out by buying these games?
I mean, for instance, we bought Forksift. It was a Stapelgabler Simulator, the Simulation 2. It's like the forklift simulator 2. That's just 60, which is great.
Okay.
Just random budget stuff like that. Like you just see 60, and that's kind of how it was on PS2 as well. But PS3, PS4 era, that was not the case. In most games, 60 tended to be more of a feature. And now it's just kind of like that's typically what they aim for. And those games that try to push the visual envelope or have other issues are the ones that might slip below it. But even when they do slip below it, it's still pretty good. Like you think back to last gen, we had stuff like Killzone Shadowfall launching with that really unstable frame rate. You had the Tomb Raider Definitive Edition on PS4 that was like mostly 45 FPS, I'd say, if you look at an average. And like once the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X came out, there was so many performance modes that were just more like 45 FPS modes, if you know what I mean. Yeah, we're just seeing a lot more games hitting and sticking close to 60 with maybe some dips, but by and large, the overall experience goes for 60. And I think that we're in a pretty good spot right now on the console side. But you did say 30 and issues returning. I think that is mostly due to some of the new Unreal Engine 5 stuff. Some of the new techniques that are being deployed are perhaps pushing it a little bit.
Yeah, your Lords of the Fallen and your Avium.
Right.
Although Avium was only targeting 60. Did they add a 30 mode to it? I can't.
No,
they never did.
No, it was 60.
Yeah, it was always 60, but with poor image quality, I would say.
Okay. Do you think that, so you don't consider that VRR is being used as a crutch then?
I think in most cases, not really. I don't think developers are doing that necessarily.
I mean, speaking as someone who hasn't got a VR enabled display over here, I've got a LG OLED B8 from quite a few years back. I missed the boat on that one, and I haven't felt like I've missed out, but it is for sure one of the top features that I would like to have, along with eArc. But yeah.
Okay. I guess, well, here's the thing, right? Because I do remember a tweet from a while back, John, where you kind of assumed that most people had HDMI 2.1 screens, or at least modern screens.
Yeah.
And it actually turned out that a lot of people were still seeing screen tearing and whatnot. So they were still using more traditional displays. I'd be curious to know what the actual split was. Maybe we should just do a Twitter poll.
It's interesting because VRR has kind of been in TVs now for a while.
A long time, yeah.
And it's been in monitors for more than a decade now.
Yeah.
So like even lower end stuff, if you bought a TV in the last like 5 years, you should have all these features already. And sometimes if you bought it earlier, you might as well. But I guess not everybody's upgrading their TVs as often, which is probably wise in retrospect as someone that often upgrades TVs.
I think this is now a really good time to upgrade.
Yeah,
because the HDMI 2.1 features are mature, and the screen quality these days is pretty special. And you don't have to break the bank in getting an OLED these days. It's quite remarkable. I saw a deal the other day for a 48-inch LG. It was like £660. It was nuts. And I don't want to break your heart on this one, John, but I was looking at the bargain forums. LG had some sort of specific discount code, and people were getting G2 77-inch screens for £1,700.
Wow.
That's just phenomenal. That's what I paid for my B6 back in
right.
2016, 55-inch. Yeah, phenomenal. Yeah, so I'm not sure there's a crutch there as such. And I think as long as there's still a majority of people that are on sort of more traditional screens without VRR, there will be, hopefully pretty good performance. And I think ultimately there's also a sort of push to ensure proper budgeting for, per frame budgeting, to target either 60 or 30 as opposed to some intermediate target in between. I do think we're probably years away from VRR being, offering developers carte blanche to run at whatever performance levels they want within a more wider window. And I think, to be fair, dynamic resolution scaling has actually worked in the other direction, targeting a set performance level by actually adjusting the pixel count on the fly. But certainly not so much as a crutch, but as a sort of insurance measure. VRR is great right now. Let's move on to the next question. This one from Paul Kalamata. With Hellblade 2 releasing this week and Black Myth Wukong releasing later this summer, will this mark the beginning of a slew of games coming out this generation using the full suite of Unreal Engine 5 features? Lumen, photogrammetry, metahue, etc. Or do you think we'll see limited use of all of this technology, considering how demanding it is on current generation hardware? What do you reckon about this, Tom?
I think we're hopefully past the teething phase with a lot of the games. We've had the Matrix Awakens demo. We've had a lot of cool stuff, but it's not quite over the line on current gen console hardware for getting a locked performance with good image quality as well. I think if we're going into an era with mid-gen refresh consoles, which looks increasingly likely, we're going to see a lot of developers be encouraged by the specs on those machines to push for those features, and hopefully not leave the base machines in the dust. But there would be a more of a drive to get Unreal Engine 5 used properly in these games. And I think Hellblade also just is an inspiring example to a lot of developers, because just look at the visual quality in that game. And I'm sure a lot of developers will be looking at that and thinking, well, we could have that quality of a visual in our action game or whatever it happens to be. So, I think it has paved the way. And Wukong, Black Myth Wukong, we've seen a couple of gameplay reveals. It looks impressive. Still yet to actually play it myself, though. So, jury's out on that one.
Yeah, I think, what can I say about this? I think ultimately, Unreal Engine is a toolbox, and it will be scaled according to the needs of the game. And not every game is going to need to use all of those features, to be clear. But obviously, I think we will see more fully featured deployments. I still think, we still haven't seen what the Coalition are cooking up. I think one thing from Hellblade that springs to mind, John, is it doesn't seem to be using the hardware ray tracing version of Lumen, right?
That's right. It's not using hardware Lumen. It's the software path.
Right. Mm-hmm. So maybe this is something that would differentiate like the PS5 Pro from the PS5, or maybe it just be the case that we're just going to see natural evolution of Unreal Engine 5 because it's already, as we saw in Alex's recent video, just it's just getting better and better all the time.
Yeah, it's getting faster, and this is, even though it's just come out, this game was one of the first, I'd say, or earlier UE5 games in development, right? So I'm sure they were somewhat limited in certain areas by performance limitations of the older Unreal Engine 5 stuff. Mm-hmm. So I expect all this stuff to continue to improve and speed up in time.
Yeah, I think it's just going to come down, as I said, to the scale of the project, the needs to use all of those features, and how performant they actually become across the fullness of time. And hopefully we'll get to see some great stuff sooner rather than later, because I think part of the appeal of Unreal Engine to many is that there are some really high profile developers that are sort of almost working hand in glove with Epic to make the engine better and to the betterment of all. So long may that continue. Let's move on to the next question. Hey DF crew, ! This one's from Anxiously Chronoed Figured. If you were to choose which game from the past should get some RTX remix love, which one would you like to see first and why? So just to sort of point out to people who might not be aware, RTX remix is essentially like it's an NVIDIA toolset. You can basically plug in full path tracing, full ray tracing, DLSS 3, DLSS reconstruction into older games and revolutionize them. We've seen some amazing stuff, particularly from the mooted Half-Life 2 remastered that's happening. Also Need for Speed Underground. It's looking pretty awesome. So essentially, John, I think we're looking at games going up to DX8.
Right.
We might have discussed this in book before, but what titles in
Two
particular?
that come to mind, I've said it before, Unreal 1. I want to see Unreal 1 properly path traced.
Right, yes.
I think that would be stunning. That's a perfect example of that. Also, another one I would love to see is Giants Citizen Kabuto, which was a game I loved back on the PC. And it just has this like big outdoor kind of stuff that could benefit from like proper path trace lighting and everything. It could look really amazing, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Tom, any thoughts on this one?
My first thought was I'd love to see StarCraft 2. I know I'm a huge sucker for that game.
Isn't that 2D?
No, that's
StarCraft 2.
StarCraft 2 is 3D, but I think it's DX9.
It's 9, yeah, and there's got a 10.
That's disappointing, isn't
Yeah,
it? Because I agree with you.
Well,
that would have been
I
beautiful.
think it actually uses possibly DX11 now either.
Really?
It was
both.
They
it was
mode
designed for
both.
DX9, but it's compatible with DX10, it says, but maybe they've upgraded since, but yeah, that wouldn't work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
in fact, there's loads of RTS games which I'd love to see. Supreme Commander, but again, I'm not sure if that's DX8. It's I think with that sort of game, there's a real benefit to seeing the shadows beneath characters as they like walk, and relative to the position of the sun as well. I think there's a lot you could do with RTX and in those sort of games.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about classic 3D games that I'd love to see with full path tracing. I just don't know if it's possible, but, anything that's related to Sega's Model 1 to 3, I'd like to see path tracing.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure whether RTX Remix would be able to do that, though. Because
I don't know what API they're using on Supermodel right now, but I think it's going to be out. It wouldn't be suitable for that, but man, that would be cool.
But older supermodels predate DX9, surely?
Yeah, but they're not necessarily good enough either.
Right.
They're missing a lot of features.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, Max Payne, obviously. I mean, the thing is, all of these classic games, the way RTX Remix works is basically you play the game and RTX Remix is sitting in the background, grabbing all of the draw calls, and then it sort of creates, a plugin for the game that just adds full path tracing, and then you can go in and add different assets, add different objects, add lights, all of this stuff, and just revolutionize these games. So, Need for Speed is the game that's really sort of catching eyeballs at the moment. Also, of course, there's the Half-Life 2 remaster going on, but there's going to be other titles, surely, like older Elder Scrolls. Was that DX9? Morrowind, possibly.
Morrowind
I
would
think
not
Morrowind.
be DX9, but I don't know what Oblivion is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I mean, we're going to be taking a closer look at RTX Remix going forward and trying to keep abreast of what's happening there, because whenever Alex does some coverage of, basically path-traced versions of classic PC games, it's always good stuff.
I want to look at the toilets.
Yeah, of course, he does like looking at path-traced toilets. But that's another topic entirely.
We'll involve Alex for that one.
Skippity dope, dope, dope. Oh no, it's coming.
Let's move on to our final question. This one comes from Aliasing Anonymous, aka Mr. I Rog Daily. I don't know what's going on there.
Rog.
I'll keep it brief. The year is 2030. Is 8K gaming a thing? John, what do you think?
I mean, it'll probably be at least similar to today, where technically a thing. But I actually think people have largely, thankfully, not really taken that much interest in it, because I think it's just the pixel pitch is so small at that point that it's not really that useful in most situations. Like if you're sitting back in a living room and looking at a TV, until you're like getting into like Samsung the wall territory, I feel like 8K is going to be almost impossible to perceive. And I think 8K has so many pixels that developers will continue to want to pour that pixel power into other things. And I think 4K is still going to be good enough. This isn't like before where, going from 1080p to 4K became more useful because TVs were getting noticeably larger. You actually could see like a visible difference, right? With 4K becoming much sharper. But
Sure.
I mean, Rich, you had an 8K TV for a while, right?
Yeah.
And now you went back to 4K. I don't think you feel like you've lost any sort of perceived resolution or sharpness or anything, right?
No, not in the slightest.
Not in the slightest.
Yeah, basically, I've said it in the past, you're paying an immense cost in GPU power for what essentially presents as good anti-aliasing.
Yep.
And there's great ways to get good anti-aliasing now, certainly in the PC space with, the arrival of DLAA and native AA for FSR. So, that's kind of negating the need to actually brute force gigantic resolutions. I can't really see the argument for, I'm looking at now across at my 48-inch 4K screen. Maybe there'd be an argument for a higher resolution. Whether it needs to actually sort of quadruple up to 8K is certainly debatable. And I just don't really see the need for it. Ultimately, you need software.
Yeah.
I suppose PC can actually provide 8K experiences. And, the 4090 is actually a pretty reasonable 8K card if you're using DLSS.
True.
But, elsewhere, games, historically have driven high definition content, going back to Xbox 360, it sort of was a great gateway into moving to an HD display. But we're not seeing a mainstream device that's going to be doing 8K anytime soon.
Even if you could, let's say you had a high-end PC that could do 8K, would people really want to go for 8K 60 FPS max when they could go 4K 120 or higher? I think instead what we've seen is a push towards higher refresh rates, especially in the PC space, where we use 4K monitors because we're using those big 4K OLED screens, but I think most PC gamers are not actually using even 4K resolution screens. 1440p is kind of the sweet spot, or more like some of those ultra wide resolutions, but they're all sub 4K, and more instead they're focused on pushing really high refresh rates.
Yeah.
There's been no
1440p still going strong for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And 1080p is still remarkably still, the number one resolution.
Because it's if you're building a mid to lower end system and hardware's still good enough, if you have like a mid to low end card, you can still push a lot of frames as long as your resolution's in check, right? So, 1080p on a 1080p screen is going to look better than 1080p on a higher res screen.
If we're at the point where at 2024, 4K is still a minority, then there's still a long way to go until that becomes the standard before we can even start thinking about even higher resolutions. And if we are thinking about even higher resolutions, it does start in the living room. And, even at 75 inch, which was what my 8K screen was, I just didn't see a compelling use case for it. And I didn't actually see that much in the way of 8K media content, outside of gaming that actually made it worthwhile. And I'm not seeing that change. And I think part of the reason for that is, the streaming demands to actually make 8K decent. If we are talking about videos via like Netflix or whatever, the bandwidth requirements for that would be huge. And, possibly not that great.
Actually, you might end up sacrificing other aspects of the encode, right?
Yeah,
like your bit rate and such suffers more, and like you end up with more macro blocking, even if the resolution's technically higher.
Yeah,
and you look at the way stuff's filmed, like the practicality of like film lenses and such. Like they're not really taking advantage of that extra sharpness by and large.
Yeah, for sure. In the world of films, you've got 8K cameras, red cameras, and even 12K, but it's usually they zoom into it. You use that as a tool to get the best framing and then work from that. So, but as you say, Rich, it's about the whole pipeline to get 8K to your TV, and that involves the renderer, the PC for gaming, and the internet being there for the internet speeds being there for streaming films. And I think the only use case I can think of for 8K is if you've got a massive massive display. We can really make out the individual pixels, but yeah, we're talking cinema sized, really, to make the most of that. I've been happy with this I'd be happy still. I'm happy still playing games at a native 1440p on this 4K. There's a lot of games where I'm like, well, this is still very good. I'm very happy with that.
I mean, one thing I will say is that, assuming we do hit 2030 here, and it is about 8K gaming, there is still this sort of, there's a push now for wider scalability for games, and that is being driven by stuff like Steam Deck, right? So, the demands being placed on games in terms of scalability, the notion that you've got to support these lower end devices does mean that, well, 2030, we could be looking at like the, I don't know, the RTX 9090. And, there'll still be this gigantic gap between what a handheld can do and what a fully spec'd out PC could do. And maybe there would be sort of like just, it will just be able to do it, and maybe the displays will arrive in full force and people might buy into that in a world where people are buying 27-inch 4K screens for some reason. So maybe it will happen just sort of organically, but I can't see it being a quote unquote thing, as Aliasing Anonymous says there. But, could be proved wrong. And ultimately, the experience has got to be palpably improved. And based on my first-hand experiences with an 8K screen, nah. Yeah, afraid not. All right, that's the final question there for the end of the show. So please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed it. Ring the bell for whatever messages may or may not appear. DF Supporter Program, join us. Join our amazing community. Get early access to a great bunch of videos we put out. Bonus materials, our amazing Discord community. It's all good stuff. And of course, store.digitalfoundry.net for our fabulous selection of merchandising wares. But that's all from us on this one. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry, and we'll see you next week.